Welcome to the 19th Century Novel Podcast, Episode 29, Louis Couperus, The Hidden Force, Part 2. Couperus next turns to the half-Indo, half-Solo family of de Luce. Indo is shorthand for Indies-born European. Solo refers to the residents of Sukarta, a city about 200 miles west of Pasuruan, Labuwangi. It's near here in 1892 that the fossilized remains of Homo erectus erectus, better known as Java man, were discovered. It was here, too, along the Solo River in 1933 that a less well-known and much more recent hominid, Homo erectus soloensis, or Solo man, was discovered, believed to be the last of the Homo erectus species before they went extinct. Generally considered to have been the first species to have expanded beyond Africa, according to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, Homo erectus is considered a highly variable species spread over 2 continents. It's not certain whether it reached Europe, and possibly the longest-lived early human species, about 9 times as long as our own species, Homo sapiens, has been around. With roots in Surakarta, the de Luce family, Couperus tells us, had once been millionaires, but they lost much of their wealth due to the sugar crisis of the 1880s, caused in part by the replacement of imported cane sugar in Europe with locally produced beet sugar. All of the de Luce family live in the shadow of the Pajurum sugar factory, 14 miles from Labuwangi. The eldest son, its manager, 3 sons-in-law clerks, 3 younger sons working in the factory, the countless grandchildren playing round and about the factory, the great-grandchildren springing up round and about the factory. The de Luce family is inseparable from the mainspring of their wealth, the sugar factory, with even their house built onto the factory, groaning during the milling season with the sound of machinery, the noise like the screw of a steamer. The history of this family, as recounted by Couperus, seems incredible, but is based on fact. The grandmother, a Solo princess, married Ferdinand de Luce, a Bohemian adventurer from the island of Mauritius, who had wandered about, Couperus writes, for many years in search of his place in the sun. Once arrived in Java, he prepared food that won the favor of the Solo prince, whose daughter he later married, and even gained the confidence of the old Susuhunan. Susuhunan is a shortened version of a title used by royalty in Surakarta. The full title, Wikipedia informs us, is Senpai an Dalam Inkang Sinoan Kanjeng Susuhunan Prabu Sri Paku Buwana Sen Apati Ing Alaga no Abdu Rahman Sahidin Panatagama, which translates as His Exalted Majesty, the Sasunan King Paku Buwana, commander in the field of battle, servant of the Most Gracious, the regulator of religion. Ultimately, Ferdinand de Luce got into sugar, from which he gained a fortune. The marriage between the French de Luce and the Solo princess began a lineage of mixed-race relationships, whose complicated entanglements Couperus details. The eldest daughter was married to a full-blooded blonde Dutchman. The son who came after her married an Armenian girl. The 2 other girls were married to Indos, both brown, and their grown children, who were also married and also had children, mingled with the blonde family of the eldest daughter. But the pride of the whole family was the youngest son and brother, Addy, who courted Addy Van Oudijck, and who was constantly in Labuwangi, the family milling season notwithstanding. The season is over now, and a languorous Indies calm had set in. The de Luces are entertaining guests. Léonie, Theo, and Addy Van Oudijck have come for the festivities. Their appearance here causes Couperus to remark on the striking racial diversity in Java. It was strange to see the different types, the pretty milk-white Léonie beside the yellow, wrinkled Rodden-Aju dowager, Theo, pale and blonde as a Dutchman, Doddy, already looking like a ripe rose, with the sparkling irises and black pupils in her dark eyes, the manager's son, Addy de Luce, brown, tall, and stout, the second son, Roger, brown, short, and thin, the little Armenian wife, the eldest daughter, old already, brown, stupid, ugly, with her full-blooded Dutch husband, who looked like a peasant, the other sons and daughters in every shade of brown, and not easily distinguished one from the other, around them the children, the grandchildren, the little golden adopted children, and over all these people who shared a common pride in their solo ancestors, crowning their heads, was the pale halo of Javanese aristocracy. Among this crowd of young and old, milky white, brown, pale, blonde, and golden, one person stands out, Addy. He's a glorious blend of European and Javanese, Indo and Solo, white and brown. A man, writes Couperus, in whom the blood of the Solo princess and that of the French adventurer had blended harmoniously. It had not given him any brains, but it had given him the physical beauty of a young Eurasian, with something of the Moor about it, something southern and seductive, something Spanish, as though in this last child the two alien racial elements had for the first time mingled harmoniously. While gifted with an almost supernatural beauty, Addy lacks any introspection or the ability for abstract thought. As Couperus puts it, Addy did not seem to possess a modicum of intellect or imagination, and was incapable of uniting two ideas into one composite thought. He merely felt. He was like a beautiful animal, degenerate in soul and brain, while his body had become like a renewal of race. Addy's simple-mindedness doesn't interfere with his sex appeal. He enjoys sexual relations with countless women, or as Couperus says much more lyrically, his garden was full of flowers which all lifted themselves up to him. He stretched out his hand almost without looking. He merely plucked. But he doesn't pluck Dolly, who is desperately in love with him. It seems that her position as daughter of the resident keeps her out of reach, since he was still a little awed by the resident's daughter. As they sat rocking around the table, the women saw him come through the garden, Couperus narrates, and the eyes of all the women were drawn to him as to a young tempter, stepping out of the sunshine, and surrounded him as with a halo. Seeing him, Doddy turned pale, and Léonie Van Oudijck's milky complexion became tinged with a rosy shade. Beauty and sexuality are combined here in religious terms. Addy wears a halo. He was a devastating young god, an unthinking god. Léonie worships her sensuality, and she is worshipped by others. Her beauty and sexuality have made her something of a goddess. She had achieved a cult. She is a priestess who denied some men entry into her temple, but to the others the temple was open. These temples and goddesses suggest antiquity, fertility cults, a far cry from the Victorian angel in the house, as is Léonie's role in choosing her sexual partners. She decides instinctively whom she's attracted to, whom she'll dally with. In one man it was his bearing or his voice. In another it was the way his hand rested on his knee. But whatever it was, she saw it directly, at a glance. She knew it instantly. She knew at once who she rejected, and they were the majority, and whom she approved, and they were many. In earlier 19th century novels, particularly in Britain, women are often seen as sexless. They're not unaware of male physical beauty. They're attracted to handsome young men with a good moral character, and sometimes to handsome scoundrels, but there's little sense that they seek sexual fulfillment. They instead seek a lifelong partner, unlike Léonie, who wants multiple partners for short-term affairs. The last thing Léonie wants, in fact, is courtship and romance. She never flirted. She was sometimes even a little boring, stiff, correct, smiling. Before the world, in the circles about the marble tables, she vouchsafed not a glance, not a pressure of the hand or knee, nor did her dress ever incline to a trouser leg. Léonie desires neither the giddiness of flirtation nor a deep emotional connection with another. For Léonie, as for Addy, plucking was all. She is aroused by Addy's appearance. As he approached with his halo of sunshine, she judged him once more, his comely, slender sensuality, and the glow of his tempter's eyes in the shadowy brown of his young Moorish face, the curve of his lips meant only for kissing, with the young down of his mustache, the feline strength and litheness of his Don Juan limbs. It all dazzled her. Just as she chooses sexual partners by their idiosyncratic individual characteristics, a voice, the way a hand rests on a knee, so she's attracted to Addy's hands. She could have kissed those hands. She suddenly became smitten with the shape of the fingers, with the brown tiger strength of the palms. She suddenly became smitten with the wild young animal vigor, which breathed like a fragrance of manhood from his boyish frame. She felt her blood throbbing, almost uncontrollably. She had an object to fill the days that were coming. The object which until now had filled her days, her lover and stepson Theo, sees that she desires Addy. Although Léonie sees that he sees this, she, seized with desire, has no wish to dissolve her relationship with him or to not begin a new relationship with Addy. She looked at Theo, broad and tall and blond, writes Couperus, a young version of her husband, his Indies blood showing only in his sensual mouth, and she did not want to lose him. She wanted to keep his type beside the type of the Moorish tempter. She wanted them both. She wanted to taste the difference between their male charms. Her soul quivered. Her blood thrilled. She was in such a state as she had never experienced before. She was surprised to be 30 and to feel this for the first time. A feverish depravity blossomed up within her, as though bursting into intoxicating red flowers. She would have liked to have held them both, Theo and Addy, in one embrace, in one commingling of different passions, pressing them both to her amorous body. A middle-aged woman consumed with sexual desire and fantasizing about a ménage à trois. We've come a long way since the first half of the 19th century and the innocent heroines of Anne Bronte, even the conniving courtesans of Honoré de Balzac. So what are we to make of Léonie? What is Couperus's attitude towards her? She has no interior world and no interest in the world outside her boudoir, whether the exploitation of natives by the Dutch or her husband's policy decisions as administrator or the social life of the European community. She has no real interest in anyone but herself, narcissistic, slothful, deceitful, uncurious, and immoral. Surely Couperus doesn't want us to admire her. Even so, she's a compelling figure. There's something perversely admirable about a person pursuing pleasure so thoroughly, whose interests rarely stray past the carnal, who, in this narrow sense, can be seen as radical. That it's a female character who seeks sexual pleasure beyond anything else makes her even more remarkable. We can look down on her for ignoring, or more accurately, debasing her motherly role. Likewise, utterly uninterested in fulfilling her social role, she turns over her official duties as a wife of the resident to another woman, Eva Eldersma. She sleeps with her stepson and with her stepdaughter's beloved without ever considering the consequences. Couperus surely doesn't want us to admire this behavior, and yet the very fact that in a society which had for so long denied and repressed female sexuality, this woman pursues her desires beyond all bounds of propriety makes her a compelling character, alluring us just as she does those around her. Two elements can help us answer the questions posed by Léonie's character. The first is biographical. Couperus was raised by and from an early age had close relationships with women, an experience that likely made him curious about and sensitive to their needs. In addition, reaching sexual maturity as a teenager in Java, he probably did not perceive as natural and inevitable the conventionally conservative Dutch attitudes toward gender and sexuality. Described as effeminate and foppish, having a childless and what seems to have been a companionate marriage, he was, most scholars assume, probably gay. His sexuality may explain what seems a greater interest in depicting Léonie's desire for beautiful men than these men's desires for beautiful Léonie. The second element that can help us understand Léonie is the novel's cultural context, the fin de siècle and its preoccupation with the decadent, a characteristic that Léonie embodies. Some scholars have noted that in art of the fin de siècle, women are often depicted as femme fatale, as cold, dominating, castrating figures, which we can see, to cite one notable example, in Aubrey Beardsley's illustration of Salome. Such depictions of dangerous and deadly women can be read as personifications of male culture's fear of new women who have refused to accept their subservient and desexed roles as wives and mothers. As English professor emeritus at UC San Diego Bram Dijkstra argues, when women become increasingly resistant to men's efforts to teach them, in the name of progress and evolution, how to behave within their appointed station in civilization, men's cultural campaign to educate their mates, frustrated by women's inherently perverse unwillingness to conform, escalated into what can truthfully be called a war on women. On this view, Léonie is an ambiguous figure, a woman whose resistance to male expectations is admirable but destructive, a, from the male perspective, seemingly perverse unwillingness to conform to social conventions, becoming literally perverse. It's tempting to see Léonie in this context, since there is something monstrous about her. But even if she takes pleasure in the suffering of others, especially her husband, she's no Salome. She wants no man's head on a platter. She wants him in her bed. She's decadent and perverse in the way of an 1890s dandy, dismissing the serious, pragmatic, moralizing world for a languid world of sensual pleasure. Her dreamy surrender to cheap, sentimental, commercial images has something of the aesthete about it. There's even a sense of camp in a Douglas Sirk kind of way in her appreciation for a large colored advertisement, a sort of floral nymph with a veil that was being torn from her by playful little perfumed cherubs. She could not imagine anything else with a greater aesthetic appeal, even though she knew that the picture was monstrous. In many ways, she resembles Couperus himself, who subscribed to conventions that are said to be typical of decadence: exoticism, eroticism, aestheticism, and a preference for whatever happens to be illicit. Couperus drew such a convincing portrait, argues Beekman, because she reflects certain aspects of his own personality. As Léonie fantasizes about Addy, Addy is trying to seduce a reluctant Doddy, who tells him, "I don't dare go any further. I'm frightened that the Gardu will see us, and then there's a Hadji walking over there, in a white turban." As she is yielding, promising with her arms around his neck, she again sees the figure of the Hadji dressed in white. But this time it turns out to be her stepmother Léonie, wearing a white silk kimono, who, in her maternal role, reproaches Doddy for walking out so late, and tells Addy he shouldn't behave like this, and makes him promise never to do it again. After consoling a crying Doddy and sympathetically conducting her to her room, she speaks to Addy. She reproached him and warned him and said that Doddy was a child and that he should not take advantage of her. He shrugged his shoulders, defended himself with his bravado, and his words fell upon her like gold dust, while his eyes glittered like a tiger's. While arguing that he must spare Dolly, Léonie seizes his hand, and she pressed it and almost cried, and implored him to have mercy on Doddy. He looked at her with the lightning of his wild animal glance, and he thought her beautiful, thought her a woman, white as milk, and he knew her for a priestess full of secret knowledge. Their encounter continues. Still pretending to weep and entreat and implore, she led him on and opened the door to her room. Then she gave him a laugh of welcome, and he, the tempter, was amazed at the glow of that laugh and this white blonde temptress who flung her silken kimono to the ground and stood before him like a nude statue spreading out her arms. Couperus says nothing more about their sexual encounter, gives no description of the sex act. While literary standards had become less restrictive, allowing for the depiction of female sexual desire, we still can't see this desire fulfilled. We aren't allowed a peek into the bedroom to watch this couple. In fact, Couperus had trouble with the English bookseller, and according to Beekman, Couperus found himself vilified as an immoral, perverse, and effeminate author whose work was unfit to be published in periodicals because it corrupted the minds and mores of the wives, sisters, and daughters of decent Dutchmen. Many critics denounced him for writing pornography and improper decadence. Leaving the lovers behind, Couperus takes us to Léonie's maid's room. She's awake, imagining the sarongs she'll get for keeping this assignation secret, when she sees outside the strange figure of a white turbaned Hadji. Again, a ghostly and religious figure appears in conjunction with a sexual encounter. The next day, Scenario's brother, the regent of Nganjwa, arrives and is greeted with the usual formality and grandeur. But he snubs Léonie because he's aware of what her husband has concluded about his gambling losses. This man's misdeeds are apparent. His features were hardened and his eyes burned out from passion. Passion for women, for wine, for opium, the passion above all, for gambling. Contrary to the wishes of Van Oudijck, the de Luces seek to give in to this passion, asking permission from Léonie, the wife of the resident, the wife of the high official, who, they knew, hated the gambling which was their ruin. Léonie doesn't object. She was indifferent to her exalted station, unimpressed that she would be greeted with a ceremony not far short of royal honors, or that in the provinces the wife of a resident can be a queen. What did her husband's policy matter to her, she asks herself. What did the whole Dutch policy matter, which wants to secure the position of the Javanese nobility, through whom it governs the population? All that matters are herself, Theo, and Addy. She wanted them both. She wanted both white and brown, for what else was there in life but to yield to one's luxurious cravings? A jealous Theo, meanwhile, has become aware of her indiscriminate cravings and so confronts Addy in his home. But Addy is untroubled by Theo's intrusion. He laughed so serenely at the idea of fighting about a woman, explains Couperus, that Theo quieted down and came and sat on the edge of his bed, and then Addy, who was a couple of years younger, but possessed incomparable experience, told him that he really mustn't do this again, get so angry about a woman, a mistress who gave herself to another. And so, peacefully, they discuss women and girls, and Addy's relationship with Doddy, before Addy asks Theo if he knows anything about having a young brother, a young son of his father's, from the time when the old man was still controller at Ngajwa, that is, a minor official in a different province. Theo knows nothing about what even the lowliest coolie knew, Addy explaining that this half-brother does nothing except curse and swear, declaring that he was a son of the resident who allowed him to rot, and he survived on what he got by shameless begging. Still in the province of Ngajwa, 12 miles from Labuwangi, passing men and women heading home after their shift in the sugar factory, Addy and Theo seek out Van Oudijck's bastard son, si-Oudijck. Beekman explains that si is a Javanese familiar title used before the name of a social equal or inferior. In si-Oudijck's case, it would refer to a social inferior and might read translated as the Oudijck or that Oudijck. Couperus again sets the scene at dusk. The sun was going down in a fan-shaped glory of orange sheaves, and the distant rows of trees that outlined the rice fields were like dark soft velvet against this arrogant glow. Soon night descended on everything, like the hasty fall of a gauze curtain. The setting sun and hasty onset of darkness serve as a literal foreshadowing, readying us for the darkness to come. That night came so suddenly, the hasty fall of a gauze curtain, while serving a dramatic purpose, actually is a realistic depiction of sunset in equatorial latitudes. The sun sets more quickly there, because it's at a nearly perpendicular 90 degrees, whereas the farther one gets from the equator, the more oblique the angle and the longer the sunset. Couperus's references to the brilliant Indies sun stem as well from his own time in Java, where he lived from the age of 9 to 15. He remembers, "What I found so marvelous was that the sun shone. The sun, that was something improper, something hidden in Holland, even if the sun did shine during summer. But a steady sun, that was something divine. I adored the sun. The sun was a god, and the moon was his wife." Beekman argues that the glory of the sun speaks also of Couperus's discovering his sexuality, something hidden in Holland, something that could be expressed more openly in the Indies. Like many people who spend their formative years in a foreign country with a completely different culture and climate, Couperus became alienated from his homeland, refusing, Beekman tells us, the narrow provinciality of Dutch literary life and the oppressive atmosphere of Dutch society. After the success of his first novel, Elena Veer, Couperus chased the sun in restless sojourns along the Mediterranean, especially in Italy. He returned to Java in 1899, where he began writing The Hidden Force, despite earlier saying that he couldn't set a novel there because of the difficulty portraying such heterogeneous types, such complicated circumstances, and such a curious society. When Addy and Theo meet si-Oudijck, he's living in a little house built partly of old bamboo, partly of old packing crates, a place where everything was permeated with the acrid odor of opium. The half-brothers meeting causes each to consider his father. Theo is glad to have made this discovery as a weapon against the old man, if the weapon ever became necessary, and si-Oudijck secretly restrains behind his brown, crafty, leering face all his jealousy, bitterness, and hatred. Si-Oudijck explains that Van Oudijck has denied his paternity, a claim he dismisses because everyone in Ngajwa, where Van Oudijck had served as administrator, knows the truth. Also, on her deathbed, his mother had sworn that Van Oudijck was his father. Theo relishes the fact that this magnanimous man, a functionary of the highest integrity in the world, who loved his domestic circle, who loved his residency, who loved the Javanese, had secretly impregnated his housekeeper, and had rejected her for an infidelity of which she was guiltless. The child born later and never recognized, never supported, the boy wandering from kampong to kampong, romantically proud of his inhuman father, whom he watched from a distance. Kampong can refer to a village, or to a gathering together, as in, say, a neighborhood, or in this case, something more akin to a slum. Theo's animus toward his father comes in part from sympathizing with his mother and, writes Couperus, from a secret antipathy in his blood. He felt a secret kinship with his illegitimate brother. Couperus's understanding here seems to accord with contemporaneous views that associated personality traits with race, with, in other words, blood. Theo's animus toward his father on this account is derived from an innate sympathy for those with a similar ethnicity and a shared blood. From a Javanese native's perspective, which, despite his blonde hair and fair skin, is how he identifies himself, his father is a colonial exploiter. He and his half-brother are sons of the self-same motherland, for which their father felt nothing except the artificially, humanely cultivated love of the ruler for the territory that he governs. Theo's hatred is also selfishly motivated. His father has pulled no strings to help him start a career, insisting that he succeed on his own merit, and so he has been forced to hang around the house, unable to find a job, thanks to his father, and merely tolerated in that house where he disliked everything. At this point, Couperus shifts the scene to examine the life of the man Theo and si-Oudijck despise. Otto Van Oudijck was of a small percentage of officials who were born in the Netherlands. From a simple Dutch family, he studied in a program at a special institute in the city of Delft, designed to produce Indologists, taught the Malay language and trained in the ways of the natives and the procedures of the colonial administration. A similar school, William III College, had been established in Batavia to prepare Java-born Dutch and Eurasians such as Frans van Helderen for similar administrative work. Van Oudijck advanced steadily and quickly through this colonial system, becoming a resident at a young age. He has little desire to return to Holland, although he remains very Dutch. He hated anything that was half-caste, a hatred that does not apply to his children. Presumably their appearance, except for his dark-skinned daughter Doddy, marks them as European, as does their place as the children of the resident. It's not strictly people who are half-caste that he hates, then, but those who, like his bastard son si-Oudijck, are not merely dark-skinned, but live in the native community, practice Javanese rituals, and hold Javanese beliefs. We also learn that every day Van Oudijck receives anonymous letters, some of which besmirch the reputations of his assistants. Others make slanderous claims about his wife, and some allege that he has fathered an illegitimate child. We should take a minute to consider why Theo, half Dutch and half Javanese, is considered Van Oudijck's son and lives in the splendor of the resident's residence, while si-Oudijck is relegated to smoking opium in a rickety hut. Why is one given the privileges of a European, the other the difficult life of an impoverished native? The difference is that si-Oudijck was born illegitimately, his patrimony unacknowledged. His mother was a housekeeper and seemingly a concubine for Van Oudijck, a common arrangement, as Jean Gelman Taylor, a senior lecturer in history at the University of New South Wales, elaborates. Men living in concubinage sought their concubines among the free population of the Indonesian villages. The women selected assumed management of the European's household and staff, a position that gave rise to the common colonial expression for concubine, housekeeper. Taylor explains the logic that makes Theo European and si-Oudijck Javanese. The status of Eurasian children depended entirely on their white fathers. When they were acknowledged, such offspring were Europeans. When not, they were Indonesians. To be accepted as European required, generally, Christian baptism with a Dutch name, Dutch schooling, and Dutch costume, as well as permanent residence in a European household. His patrimony denied, si-Oudijck is denied entry into this world of privilege and must survive in the world of the kampong. Olby Bosma and Remco Robin's description of a bastard Eurasian in Java mirrors the plight of si-Oudijck. In the 19th century, they write, the phrase assimilated into the kampong was used to refer to the descendants of Europeans whose social and cultural links with the European elite had grown weak and who lived or grew up in an Indonesian milieu. Often these children had a European father who had not adopted them or legally acknowledged them. They grew up with the family of their Indonesian mother or became vagrants in the villages and urban kampongs. Van Oudijck seems not to remember this parentage or his time with a housekeeper, blinded to his past by his prestigious position, which Rush summarizes. Residents occupied imposing official dwellings in the provincial capitals and presided over their smaller domains in a style and with a personal latitude that mimicked that of the governor-general. The resident and his assistant residents exercised a broad and loosely defined authority. They interpreted the rules and regulations of the colony for local application, administered the law, promoted special programs in which they were personally interested, and generally personified the state, often quite arbitrarily. The resident earned $10,000 a year, which by one estimate, adjusted for inflation, is the equivalent today of about $378,000. The privilege and respect and wealth shown him as resident affirms Van Oudijck's self-perception, his belief in the correctness of his own views, but it makes him blind to much else. His perception, Couperus tells us, is limited to a male, rational, European perspective. He's blind to the things that teemed and swarmed in the shadows and darkness, the things that bubbled up from the abyss. These he had never been able or anxious to see. He was blind to the life that works under life. He believed neither in the force above things, nor in the force of things themselves. He did not believe in silent fate, nor in a quiet inevitability. He believed only in what he saw with his own eyes, the harvest, the roads, districts, and villages, and in the welfare of his province. He believed only in his career, which he saw before him like an ascending path, and in the unclouded clarity of his simple masculine nature, in the universally perceptible obviousness of his upright love of authority. Because he did not believe in the hidden force, did not believe in the mysticism of tangible things, life sometimes found him weak and unprepared when, serene as the gods and more powerful than man, it deviated from what he regarded as logical. There's much to unpack here. Part of this passage can be read from a Freudian perspective. The Interpretation of Dreams was published in German in 1899, the year Couperus began writing The Hidden Force, and Freud's work on hysteria, co-written with Joseph Breuer, had been published in 1893. It's possible, therefore, that Couperus knew something of Freud's theories of the unconscious. According to Laurie Sears, professor of history at the University of Washington, Couperus admitted that, although he knew of Freud, he never read his work, but he lived in a time when the ideas of the new science of psychoanalysis were prominent in the intellectual circles in which he lived. So Couperus was working at the same time as Freud, when some of his ideas had begun to enter into intellectual discourse, although in a quite limited way. The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899, wouldn't sell out its original run of 600 copies until 1908. Drawing from ideas that were in the air at the time and that predated Freud, Couperus used a language and logic similar to Freud's to explain the workings of the unconscious, referring to dangerous things which teemed in the shadows and darkness and bubbled up from the abyss. What is this but the language of the unconscious, the life that works under life, as Couperus puts it, of the repression of desires and their inevitable, often disguised manifestation? On this reading, Van Oudijck is a pure rationalist who doesn't recognize the power of the unconscious. Or to use a Freudian term, he's all superego and thus unable to recognize the irrational and destructive impulses that motivate him, and of course, also unable to recognize the irrational and destructive impulses that motivate others. Couperus twice refers to a volcano, to mountain people who have lived long on a quiet volcano and who believe in the inner fire that persists in its mysterious depth and escapes only in the form of hot steam and the smell of sulfur, and the force that teemed and swayed like volcanic fires under the mountains of majesty, like troubles under a throne. He had also used the volcano metaphor to describe Sunario's repressed rage at being scolded by Van Oudijck. An olive pallor betrayed the silent, secret rage that was working inside him like the fire of a volcano. Couperus, writing about the East Indies, understandably chose volcanoes as a metaphor. Indonesia has the most volcanoes of any country in the world, with 76 volcanoes that have erupted at least 1,171 times in total within historical times. It has suffered the highest number of eruptions resulting in fatalities, damage to arable land, debris flows, and tsunamis. It was here in 1883 that the Krakatoa volcano exploded west of Java, not east of, as the 1968 Hollywood film title placed it. And in 1815, in the Lesser Sunda Islands, an archipelago that stretches 750 miles from Bali in the west to Timor in the east, that Mount Tambora exploded with a force many times greater than the more famous Krakatoa explosion. Tambora was the largest and most devastating observed eruption in recorded history. Its fiery plumes and ash clouds darkened the skies across the globe, creating in 1816 the year without a summer. Geology aside, it's almost impossible not to read Couperus's volcanic passages in a Freudian manner, as metaphors of the unconscious, of repressed desires escaping like steam from a volcano. He writes of fires beneath majestic mountains and the troubles under a throne, again suggesting the hidden, the repressed, what seem to be symbols of power, majestic mountains and throne, suggest instead the superego's pretense of control and authority. For the hidden volcanic forces of the unconscious may, at any time, explode the mountain's majesty, and troubles topple its throne. This passage may also be read from a feminist perspective, seeing Van Oudijck's rationalism and positivism as a narrow masculine view that's limited to the material and concrete, the harvests, the roads, the districts, etc., but that doesn't recognize the less tangible components of human relations. For example, Van Oudijck is blind to human interactions, to the true feelings of his family, his children who identify as native, not Dutch, and who are closer to their mother than to him, and his wife who has no regard for his accomplishments and who seeks sexual fulfillment with many other men. Likewise, he is blind to scenarios and his noble family's rage and its potentially explosive consequences. On this reading, native culture itself, because it's less rational and more emotional, connected to the intangible, to the hidden force, can be seen as feminine. Only the female characters in the novel, Doddy, Léonie, Léonie's maid Eurype, and Eva, either see a mysterious ghostly figure or feel genuinely disturbed by their haunted environment, and it's the men, Theo, Franz, Addy, and Van Oudijck, who dismiss these women's fears. Besides Freudian and feminist, the imagery here can be read politically. This reading is made most explicit in chapter 17, a short but remarkable chapter that stands apart. It does nothing to further the narrative or to develop the characters. Its purpose is to convey the unspoken and unacknowledged but irresistible force that opposes Dutch rule. Couperus summarizes the Dutch conquest. Outwardly, a docile colony with a subject race, which was no match for the rude trader who in the golden age of his republic, with the young strength of a youthful people, greedy and eager for gain, plump and phlegmatic, planted his foot and his flag on the crumbling empires, on the thrones that tattered. This account of the Dutch East India Company's conquest of the East Indies kingdoms during the Dutch Golden Age is followed by an account of the native reaction to this conquest. But down in its soul, it had never been conquered, though smiling in proud contemptuous resignation and bowing submissively beneath its fate. Deep in its soul, despite a cringing reverence, it lived in freedom its own mysterious life, hidden from Western eyes, however these might seek to fathom the secret. The possessive pronouns here, the its, are linked to nouns, soul, fate, freedom, life, that personify their referent, that island of mystery called Java. Couperus uses this personification and the conceit of a hidden force to convey the secret resistance of the Javanese to Dutch rule, and he shows how this resistance is hidden by a feigned submission and respect. The Javanese maintain before all a proud and smiling tranquillity, pliantly yielding and to all appearances courteously approaching, but deep within itself divinely certain of its own views. The American travel writer Eliza Ruhamah Skidmore, writing in 1897, gives evidence of the prevailing stereotype of the courteous and submissive Javanese. The Javanese are the most gentle, attractive, and innately refined people. They are little people for whom one feels an indulgent, protective sense. Skidmore contrasts the admirable Javanese with the contemptible Dutch, noting the Javanese's abject, crouching humility before their Dutch employers, and the brutality of the latter to them, which she writes is calculated to make the blood boil. Skidmore is critical of the Dutch, but her embrace of the stereotype of the submissive little Javanese keeps her from seeing within them any opposition or agency. The Dutch, too, confident in their cultural and technological superiority, are oblivious to this opposition, believing in the truth of what is a superficial appearance of courteous, smiling natives. The European, proud in his might, in his strength, in his civilization, and his humanity, writes Couperus, rules arrogantly, blindly, selfishly, egotistically, amidst all the intricate machinery of his authority, which he slips into gear with the certainty of clockwork, controlling its every movement, till to the foreigner, the outside observer, this lording it over tangible things, this colonizing of territory alien in race and mentality, appears a masterpiece, a world created. With a tone and imagery and outrage reminiscent of Karl Marx, Couperus shows us, through a string of adverbs, arrogantly, blindly, selfishly, egotistically, and mechanistic imagery, Europeans' belief that the colonized can be completely dominated to the extent of creating an entirely new world. Because of their hubris and fantasy about their domination, and ironically their ostensibly rational worldview, the Dutch don't see the strength of Javanese resistance, which denies both the inevitability of Dutch rule and its allegedly humane character. This hidden native force, Couperus argues, reads the overlord with a single penetrating glance. It sees in him the illusion of civilization and humanity, and it knows that they are non-existent. While it gives him the title of Lord and the respect due to the master, it is profoundly aware of his democratic commercial nature and despises him for it in silence and judges him with a smile which its brother understands. The it in these lines refers to the hidden force, which becomes a complicated metaphor, suggesting both what the Javanese feel and a kind of free-floating, mysterious, organic power, too amorphous to be called an ideology, too disconnected from culture to be called a structure of feeling, and too intangible to be called a movement. This force, and the Javanese whose feelings it embodies, sees through the pretense of democracy and humanity and understands the true nature of Dutch colonialism, a perception completely at odds with Van Oudijck's belief both in the purpose of his mission and the respectfully dependent role of the Javanese aristocracy to Dutch authority. James Rush explains the relationship between Dutch resident and Javanese regent. This pairing of European professional officers with local princes of the realm was designed to bridge not only two levels of the colonial bureaucratic structure, but also the disparate frames of cultural and historical reference which separated the Dutch view of things from that of the Javanese. Fully understanding this, Dutch regional officials
prided themselves on their command of Javanese language and etiquette. It's this pride, this belief in his knowledge and expertise, and his sense that he is working with the Javanese aristocracy for the sake of the Javanese people that keeps Van Oudijck from understanding their views. He believes in the stereotype of the courteous and deferential Javanese, referring to their innate courtliness and cordiality, a belief that keeps him from perceiving their true feelings about Dutch rule. As Couperus goes on to explain, but under all this show, the hidden force lurks, slumbering now and unwilling to fight. Under all this appearance of tangible things, the essence of that silent mysticism threatens, like a smoldering fire underground, like hatred and mystery in the heart. Under all this peace of grandeur, the danger threatens and the future rumbles, like subterranean thunder in the volcanoes, inaudible to human ears, and it is as though the subject race knows it and leaves matters of the latent force of things and awaits the divine moment that is to come, if there be any truth in the calculations of the mystics. Here, Couperus uses the volcano metaphor to suggest the violent anti-colonialism that for now lays dormant, but whose presence is signaled to the Javanese, while it remains inaudible to the Europeans. In perceiving a secret language of resistance that's shared by the colonized and unheard by the colonizer, Couperus anticipates post-colonial scholarship, which seeks to give voice to the colonized, to the subaltern, beyond the limits of colonial discourses. For historians and sociologists, this task has been made difficult by the abundance of written records, military and administrative reports, personal diaries, letters, autobiographies, novels, etc., from the colonizer, and the sparse records from the colonized, voices that scholars seek to recover, but which too often remain inaudible. To Europeans, the Javanese, Couperus writes, will always remain an indecipherable book, in the unknown, untranslatable tongue in which the words may be the same, but the shades of meaning expressed by them are different. Between the two, there will always be the gap, the chasm, the abyss, the distance, the width whence looms the mystery. Despite Van Oudijck's belief in his knowledge and understanding of the Javanese, these voices are unavailable, if not unknowable, to the colonizers. To the Dutch, the hidden force will remain hidden. Couperus's use of the hidden force as a metaphor for an unknowable native opposition is an accurate reflection of the limited understanding of the Dutch and the colonial powers in general, an understanding forever limited by linguistic and cultural barriers, and by the need of the colonized to keep their resistance secret. On the other hand, this metaphor mysticizes, making the difficulty the colonialist has in discovering true beliefs and feelings within Javanese culture into something unknowable because metaphysical. There's much religious imagery in this discussion, references to a belief that is divinely certain, waiting for the divine moment, and the calculations of the mystics, feeling something in the innermost depths of one's soul, not to mention the many references to a mystery. These references appropriately convey the prevailing religious sensibility in Java, with its belief in the miraculous and the supernatural, belief which spurred on an earlier unsuccessful resistance to Dutch rule, the Java War, led by the prophet figure Diponegoro. As best I understand it, the force in this part of the novel represents a religiously tinged pre-revolutionary spirit of resistance that, given a confluence of factors, may, or as Couperus presents it, will be activated.
For a transcript of this episode, along with a bibliography and other materials, please go to 19thCenturyNovel.podbean.com.